A quiet world of shadows. Lena's life was a delicate balancing act between the weight of her duties and the quiet yearning for something more. Each morning, she would rise before dawn, her small room in the servants' quarters still dark with the remnants of night, and prepare for another long day at the Sinclair estate. The mansion loomed large above her, its towering walls filled with the history of wealth and power, the legacy of a family whose fortune was only outmatched by their arrogance. The house was cold in the early hours, its silence a stark contrast to the bustling luxury that would soon fill its halls. Lena moved through the mansion like a shadow, quietly cleaning the grand hallways, polishing the marble floors, and tending to the many rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. There was an art to this kind of work, an art of invisibility. Lena had long since perfected it, learning to navigate the grand corridors without disturbing a single thing, her presence hardly noticed by the family who lived there. The Sinclair family, powerful, wealthy, and indifferent, occupied the mansion with an air of privilege that Lena could only observe from a distance. The house itself was a fortress of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like stars, casting a soft glow on the intricate tapestries and the portraits of Sinclair ancestors who glared down from their gilded frames. Their stern faces seemed to embody the relentless, unyielding nature of the family who lived here, a family that expected perfection in every corner, every detail, and every movement. The staff, a small army of maids, cooks, and groundskeepers, lived in the background, their faces rarely seen, their contributions barely acknowledged. Lena's work was tireless, demanding, and often thankless. From the moment the first guests arrived at the mansion's annual gala to the moment the last glass was cleared, she and the other staff members worked tirelessly, their movements quick and efficient as they catered to the whims of the powerful. But when the grand event was over and the guests had gone home, Lena returned to her small room, where the light was dim, and the world outside was silent. In her solitude, Lena often found herself drawn to the old metronome on her windowsill, a relic of her childhood. The rhythmic ticking reminded her of a time long gone, a time when music filled the air, and the world seemed full of possibility. She had once been a gifted pianist, her fingers dancing over the keys of a grand piano with the grace of someone born to play. But that part of her life had been lost long ago, buried under the weight of her current reality. Her mother had taught her to play, patiently coaching her through every note, every scale, every piece. Music had been their shared language, a language of the heart that transcended words. But those days were gone. The piano was no longer a part of Lena's life, and the world of beauty and creativity that had once been her refuge now felt as distant as a dream. Still, the music lived in her, a quiet echo that could be called up in the moments when she had the time and space to remember. At night, after her work was done, Lena would close her eyes and imagine the piano keys beneath her fingers, the sweet, comforting melodies that would flow from her hands if only she had the chance to play again. It was a dream that lived in the quiet corners of her mind, a dream she kept hidden from the world. But even in the deepest shadows of her life, there was a flicker of hope, a flicker of something that refused to die. In her heart, music still beat. It was a soft pulse, but it was there, a constant reminder that no matter how far removed she was from her past, the essence of who she was could never be taken away. And so, Lena carried on. She moved through the mansion's grand rooms, tending to the needs of the guests, cleaning up after them, serving them with a quiet grace that no one ever saw. She was invisible to them, a mere function of the estate, a silent servant whose only role was to ensure that the wealthy were comfortable. Yet in her heart, she held on to the memory of something more, something beautiful, something that no one could ever take from her. The gala. The Sinclair family's annual winter gala was the highlight of the season, a night when the mansion would be filled with the city's most influential and powerful figures. The air would be thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the soft rustle of silk gowns, and the clink of fine china. The ballroom would glow with the warm light of chandeliers, and the guests would be adorned in jewels and designer suits, laughing and mingling in a world that felt as far removed from Lena's own as the moon was from the earth. For weeks leading up to the event, the household staff worked relentlessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. There were floral arrangements to be made, silverware to be polished, floors to be waxed, and rooms to be transformed into scenes of gilded elegance. Lena, along with the other maids, moved through the motions with precision, following orders with the quiet efficiency that had become second nature to her. As the evening of the gala approached, Lena prepared herself for the grueling night ahead. She tied her hair back neatly, slipped into her uniform, and joined the other staff members in the servants' quarters to go over their tasks. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, was strict but fair, running the household with a sharp eye and a no-nonsense attitude. She had been in charge for years, and her expectations were high. When the first guests arrived, the mansion came alive with laughter and conversation. The ballroom, with its soaring ceiling and grand staircase, became the heart of the evening's festivities. Lena moved silently among the guests, refilling glasses and clearing plates, her presence hardly acknowledged as she went about her duties. She overheard snippets of conversation, discussions of vacations, scandalous rumors, the latest in high society gossip. But she remained an invisible figure, a servant in a world that could not have been more foreign to her. Mr. Sinclair, the patriarch of the family, was in his element. He was a man whose wealth and power were as much a part of him as the air he breathed. Dressed in a sleek tuxedo, he moved through the crowd with a practiced charm, effortlessly captivating his guests with stories and laughter. But to the staff, Mr. Sinclair was a different figure. He was a man of impossible standards, quick to criticize, and always looking for ways to remind the people around him of their place. Lena had learned this long ago, as had the other servants. To him, they were nothing more than instruments of his will, tools to be used for his convenience. As the night wore on, Lena's eyes often drifted to the grand piano that stood in the corner of the ballroom. It was a beautiful instrument, its polished black surface gleaming in the soft light of the chandeliers. She longed to sit at it, to run her fingers over the cool keys once more, but she knew that it was not for someone like her. It was reserved for the talented musicians who would occasionally entertain the guests, but never for a maid like Lena. Still, she dreamed of it, a quiet wish that lived in her heart, untouched by the grandeur of the world around her. But tonight, as Lena moved through the ballroom, something unexpected happened. Mr. Sinclair, ever the showman, spotted her standing near the edge of the room, unnoticed by the guests, but very much visible to him. His sharp eyes landed on her, and in that moment, a plan began to form in his mind. He saw an opportunity, a chance to make a spectacle out of this quiet, humble maid. Something to entertain his guests, something to showcase his power and control. With a sly smile, he beckoned Lena over, his voice cutting through the soft music and conversation. "Come here, girl," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "I think it's time we had a little entertainment." Lena froze, her heart skipping a beat. The crowd's eyes were suddenly on her, and she could feel their gaze piercing through her. Sinclair's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Lena's mind raced with fear. She could feel the judgment of the guests, the anticipation of a cruel joke at her expense. He turned to his companions, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I thought it would be fun to see what hidden talents our little maid has. You know how to play that piano, don't you?" The laughter that rippled through the room was like a slap to Lena's face. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, the humiliation pressing down on her. She had never intended to be the center of attention, never wanted to be the subject of anyone's cruel amusement. And yet here she was, caught in Sinclair's game, a pawn in his show of power. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, trying to steady herself. She knew she had no choice. To refuse would mean facing Sinclair's wrath, and she feared what he might do to her if she disobeyed. With a resigned breath, Lena nodded and moved toward the piano, each step heavy with the weight of expectation. The crowd's gaze followed her, and she could feel their judgment like 1,000 eyes boring into her back. The whispers of curiosity and amusement floated through the air, and she knew that they were waiting for her to fail, waiting to see her stumble. But as she sat at the piano, placing her trembling fingers on the cool keys, something deep within her stirred. The music, the memory of it, came rushing back, softly at first, like the quiet whisper of a forgotten dream. And in that moment, Lena made a decision. She would not be a source of amusement. She would not let them break her. She would play. The gala of expectations. The grand evening arrived with all the flair and fanfare one would expect from the Sinclair estate. The anticipation was palpable, not only among the elite guests, but also among the staff, who were preparing to cater to the whims of the wealthy. The mansion transformed into an extravagant celebration, a testament to the Sinclair family's opulence and power. Rooms shimmered with golden light, adorned with elaborate floral arrangements that reached for the sky, and towering chandeliers that sparkled like stars in the night sky. Every surface gleamed, every corner was polished to perfection, and the halls echoed with the soft rustling of silk and satin as the guests prepared for the evening's festivities. Lena stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her heart heavy with the burden of anticipation. The guests arrived in a dazzling array of colors and luxury, their laughter echoing through the hall, but all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the soft click of her heels on the marble floor. She moved among them, unnoticed and invisible, refilling drinks, clearing plates, and adjusting the fine silverware that adorned the tables. Her presence was little more than an afterthought to the guests, who were more concerned with their own revelries, their own indulgences, and the grand spectacle that was the Sinclair family's social event of the year. It was easy to blend into the background, to move like a shadow, a figure that was not seen, not heard. Lena had become an expert at this. She had learned long ago that the less she was noticed, the better. In the grand halls of the mansion, there was little room for someone like her. The Sinclairs occupied a world of privilege, a world where the invisible labor of people like Lena kept their lives running smoothly. And as always, Lena did her job quietly, without complaint, her heart a quiet echo of dreams that had no place in this extravagant world. Tonight, however, felt different. There was a sense of tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent of something that Lena couldn't quite put her finger on. The guests were excited, their chatter more animated, their laughter more boisterous. It was as though they were waiting for something that would add an extra spark to the evening. And as the night wore on, Lena could feel the pressure building, the weight of expectation in the air. She couldn't help but wonder what spectacle they were all waiting for. Mr. Sinclair, the patriarch of the household, moved through the crowd with his usual air of supreme confidence. He was the center of attention, his laughter cutting through the conversations like a blade, and his smile was a weapon honed over years of social maneuvering. Lena caught a glimpse of him from across the room, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, always assessing, always calculating. He had a way of making people feel like they were both beneath him and in awe of him at the same time. He was a man who commanded attention, who reveled in it, who needed it. Lena couldn't help but notice that tonight, more than ever, Mr. Sinclair was the picture of power and dominance. He was dressed in a sleek, tailored tuxedo, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he entertained his guests, making them laugh with stories, jokes, and well-timed anecdotes. He had the charisma of someone born to rule, to dominate, and to be admired. But behind the charm, there was something cold, something calculating that Lena had learned to recognize over the years. He was a man who thrived on control, and he would stop at nothing to assert it, even if it meant exploiting those beneath him. As the evening wore on, the sounds of laughter, music, and clinking glasses began to swirl around Lena like a storm. She moved among the guests, keeping her eyes low, her movements swift and efficient. Her heart beat in time with the rhythm of the evening, a steady pulse that seemed to match the cadence of her work. But despite her efforts to remain unnoticed, something began to shift. The eyes of the guests, once oblivious to her presence, began to linger on her. Whispers spread like wildfire, their curiosity piqued by her quiet grace, her understated beauty, and the air of mystery that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Lena's stomach twisted with unease as she moved through the crowd, trying to keep her composure. She could feel their gazes on her, assessing, scrutinizing, and she hated it. She had always been careful to avoid drawing attention to herself, to remain invisible, and yet tonight, it felt as though every step she took was being watched. Her eyes drifted once again to the grand piano at the far end of the ballroom. It gleamed under the soft lighting, its black surface reflecting the light like a mirror. The piano had always been a fixture in the room, but tonight, it seemed to call to her. A quiet longing rose in her chest, an ache that had been buried for so long. She couldn't help but imagine her fingers dancing over the keys, the music flowing from her hands once more. It was a memory she had long since pushed aside, but it refused to be silenced. In a brief moment of stillness, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Sinclair's gaze sweeping across the room. And then, as if sensing her thoughts, his eyes locked onto her. The recognition was instantaneous. She could feel the change in the air, the shift in his focus. There was something dangerous in his look, something that sent a chill down her spine. He was no longer just a distant figure in the background. He was looking directly at her, assessing her, considering her. And in that moment, Lena knew something was about to happen. Before she could react, Mr. Sinclair took a few steps toward her, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving her. His voice, smooth and commanding, cut through the chatter of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words carrying with them the weight of authority, "I think it's time we had a little impromptu entertainment." Lena's heart skipped a beat as she froze, her breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to pause, as if the very air was holding its breath. She could feel every eye on her now, the sudden intensity of the moment almost suffocating. Sinclair's gaze never wavered as he turned to the small circle of guests around him. "I thought we could use a little music," he continued, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone. "After all, who would have thought that our little maid has a hidden talent?" Lena's stomach twisted, the floor beneath her seeming to tilt. The laughter that followed was light, almost playful, but there was something cruel in it, something mocking. She felt a wave of heat flood her cheeks, a flush of humiliation that she couldn't hide. She had no choice but to stand there, frozen under Sinclair's gaze, as the guests turned their attention toward her. He continued, his smile widening. "Come now, girl," he said, his tone no longer asking but commanding. "You've been eyeing that piano all night. Surely you can play a song for us. Let's see what hidden talents you have." Lena stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. The mocking laughter of the guests surrounded her, and she could feel her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to refuse, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged, but Sinclair's gaze was unyielding. It was a challenge, a test of her submission. If she refused, the consequences would be far worse than the public humiliation she was already enduring. With trembling hands, Lena finally nodded, unable to speak, her voice stolen by the weight of the situation. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their expectations hanging heavy in the air. They were waiting for her to fail, to make a fool of herself. It was a cruel game, and she was its unwilling player. As she made her way to the piano, the sound of her steps seemed deafening in the silence that had fallen over the room. The crowd watched intently, their eyes gleaming with curiosity and cruel anticipation. Lena's heart raced in her chest, and her fingers trembled as they hovered above the keys. She could feel the weight of the piano beneath her, the cold, smooth surface of the keys. This was no longer a place of beauty, a place of memory. It was a stage, and she was the star of a show she never wanted to be part of. But as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, something inside Lena stirred. It was a quiet voice, a whisper from her past, reminding her of who she was, of what she was capable of. She thought of her mother, of the years they had spent together at the piano, and she felt the faintest spark of defiance. This was her moment, her choice, and she would not let them strip away the one thing that had ever belonged to her, the music. Lena took a deep breath and pressed her fingers to the keys. The first note broke the silence, soft but steady, like the first step of someone reclaiming their own soul. The song of defiance. Lena's fingers hovered over the piano keys, trembling but determined. The vast room was still, and the breathless silence that filled the air felt almost suffocating. She could sense the collective anticipation, the unspoken judgment of every guest in the ballroom. The weight of their gazes pressed down on her like an invisible hand, and her heart thundered in her chest. She was keenly aware of every inch of the room, of the cold marble floors beneath her feet, the towering chandelier above, and the piano in front of her, polished to a perfection that seemed unreachable. The people in the room, each one of them a symbol of wealth, power, and influence, were waiting for her to fail, waiting for the spectacle of her humiliation. But Lena refused to allow their cruel expectations to drown her. In the depths of her being, she could feel a small, defiant spark, a flame that had been hidden beneath layers of duty and silence for so long. It was the part of her that had never fully accepted her role as an invisible servant, as a pawn in the world of the Sinclairs. It was the quiet voice of resistance that had once whispered to her during those long nights when she could still hear the soft strains of music echoing in her mind. It was the essence of who she had been before the weight of her circumstances had turned her into nothing more than a figure in the background. As she sat at the grand piano, Lena took a deep breath, summoning the courage to silence the noise in her mind. Her fingers brushed lightly over the keys, feeling the coolness beneath them, a sensation that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the faces of the guests and the oppressive atmosphere of judgment. In that brief moment of stillness, she remembered her mother, her voice, soft and encouraging, urging her to let the music flow from her heart. She remembered the long hours they had spent together, sitting side by side at their humble piano, playing melodies that transcended the walls of their small home. In those moments, the world had felt full of possibility, and music had been the language through which they had expressed everything that words could not capture. Her mother had always told her that music was not just about technique, not just about hitting the right notes or impressing an audience. It was about heart. It was about feeling the music, allowing it to speak through you, and letting it connect you to something beyond yourself. Music is a gift, her mother had said, and it will always find its way back to you, even when you think you've lost it. Lena's fingers moved to the keys with the memory of her mother's words echoing in her mind. The first notes came slowly, tentative, almost fragile, like the start of a dream. They were the melody of a song she had played countless times as a child, a song that had once filled their home with warmth and light. It was a simple piece, but in its simplicity lay its power. Each note seemed to float in the air, soft and pure, like a whisper from the past. It was the music of her youth, the music of her mother's love, the music that had always brought her comfort in the quietest moments. As the first few notes filled the room, Lena could feel the change. The laughter and chatter from the guests began to fade, replaced by an almost palpable silence. It was as if the world around her had momentarily ceased to exist. The harsh lights of the ballroom dimmed, and all that remained was the music that had once been her refuge, her expression of all the things she could not say. The guests, who had gathered to witness her embarrassment, now seemed to hold their collective breath. What had started as a cruel joke, a game of humiliation, had shifted, slowly but surely, into something different. The longer Lena played, the more she felt the grip of her fear loosening. The trembling in her hands began to subside as she sank deeper into the music. With every note, she felt the layers of shame and anxiety fall away, one by one. She was no longer the maid in a room full of wealthy strangers. She was no longer the invisible servant whose every action had been scrutinized and measured. As the music flowed from her fingers, she was simply a person a soul sharing the deepest part of herself with a room full of people who had no idea what they were witnessing. In the background, Mr. Sinclair stood, a cold smile still on his face, though it seemed less certain now. His plan to make Lena the subject of ridicule had been undone, perhaps without him even realizing it. The guests around him, initially expecting to watch a performance of failure, had fallen into a stunned silence. What they had anticipated as a moment of comedy was now unfolding as something more profound, more moving than anything they had experienced that evening. The music, a delicate yet powerful force, had shifted the dynamics of the room. It was no longer about Lena's status as a maid or the Sinclairs' wealth. It was about the truth of the moment, about the emotion that pulsed through each note. Lena's fingers continued to dance over the keys, each note coming more freely, more confidently than the last. The melody filled the room, wrapping around the guests, pulling them into a world they had never known, one that existed beyond the walls of wealth and privilege. It was a world where music was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a universal language that transcended status, time, and place. And as Lena played, she realized that this music, this act of creation, was the one thing in the world that could never be stolen from her. It was hers, deeply and irrevocably hers. As the final chords of the piece echoed through the room, a stillness lingered in the air. The last note hung in the space, vibrating softly as the silence deepened. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The weight of the performance, of the music that had been shared, seemed to settle over the room like a cloak. The guests, who had once looked at Lena with disdain, now stared at her in awe. The transformation was so subtle, so powerful, that even they couldn't help but feel the change. In that moment, Lena was no longer the maid. She was an artist, a person of undeniable presence and grace, and the music had revealed that truth. Mr. Sinclair's smile had faded, his earlier confidence now replaced with an uncomfortable unease. The guests shifted uncomfortably as well, their minds struggling to reconcile the spectacle they had anticipated with the raw beauty that had just unfolded before them. The realization was dawning. Lena was not a pawn in their game. She was not a joke to be made at someone else's expense. She was someone with a depth they had failed to see, someone who had shared a part of herself they had never bothered to acknowledge. And in that moment, as the last notes of the song faded into the silence, Lena felt something shift within herself. The fear, the doubt, the years of being unseen, they all began to unravel, not completely, but enough to let something new grow in their place. She had reclaimed a part of herself that no one could take away, and the music had been her victory. No longer was she just the maid in the Sinclair mansion. She was Lena, the pianist, the woman who had dared to defy the expectations placed upon her. And she had done so with nothing but the power of her heart and her music. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt free. The aftermath of music and change. The final notes of Lena's performance lingered in the air, reverberating like a gentle ripple in a vast ocean, spreading slowly to the corners of the grand ballroom. For a long moment, there was only silence, a silence that seemed to stretch out, heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. The guests, once poised and ready for mockery, were now frozen in place, their expressions blank, as though they were unsure how to respond. Their eyes darted to each other, a flicker of confusion crossing their faces, unsure whether to applaud or simply walk away. Lena sat motionless at the piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys, her breath coming in slow, steady waves. The trembling had finally stopped, replaced by a quiet calm that filled the space inside her. Her heart still beat fast, but it was no longer the frantic rhythm of fear. It was the steady pulse of someone who had just discovered a power within themselves they hadn't known existed. As the last note faded, Lena opened her eyes, the room slowly coming back into focus. She expected to feel exposed and vulnerable, but instead there was a strange sense of pride and defiance. The music had done what words could not. It had allowed her to express what she had kept locked away for so long. The guests, who had once seen her only as a maid, a background figure in their extravagant world, were now seeing her in an entirely new light. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, not as a servant, but as a person of undeniable presence. Mr. Sinclair, who had once been so certain of his control over the evening, stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was hard to read, his usual smug smile replaced by something more restrained, almost begrudging. His gaze flickered to Lena for a brief moment before he turned away, as if unsure of how to process what had just happened. He had expected to humiliate her, to showcase his power and control, but what had occurred instead had rattled him. The guests, too, seemed unsure of how to react. There was no laughter, no mockery, only an uncomfortable, respectful silence that filled the space where amusement had once been. One by one, they turned back to their drinks, their conversations faltering for a moment before resuming, though the tone had changed. The moment of spectacle had passed, but in its place, something else had taken root, a quiet respect, perhaps even awe, for the quiet girl who had refused to be the punchline of their joke. Lena stood up from the piano, her legs unsteady, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had done it. She had reclaimed herself in the face of their expectations, their power, their ridicule. With a final glance at the piano, she turned to leave, but before she could take another step, there was a single clap. It came from one of the guests, an older woman dressed in an elegant silver gown. Her clapping was soft at first, tentative, unsure, but soon others joined in, reluctant at first, but then with growing enthusiasm. The sound of applause filled the room, not the forced, mocking claps that had been reserved for Lena's supposed failure, but genuine appreciation. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling. For a moment, it seemed as though time had slowed, and the clapping became a rhythmic pulse that matched Lena's heart, a beat that connected her to the very essence of what she had just shared. The guests, who had once been so eager to see her fail, now recognized her for what she truly was, not just a maid, but a person of incredible grace, talent, and strength. Lena felt her cheeks flush, the warmth of the applause washing over her in waves. She wasn't sure how to react. Part of her wanted to flee, to escape the attention, to retreat into the shadows once more. But another part of her, the part that had found her voice through the music, stood tall. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her head, and allowed herself to stand in the light of this unexpected recognition. The applause continued for a few moments longer before it began to fade, and slowly, the guests turned away to resume their conversations. Lena moved quietly to the side, back toward the shadows where she had once been content to live. But as she passed through the crowd, her heart was lighter, her steps more confident. She wasn't the same person who had entered that room, uncertain and afraid. She was someone who had faced her fears head-on, and had found her own strength in the process. Back in the corner of the room, Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of surprise and admiration. The strict woman had always been an enforcer of rules, a keeper of order, and had never once shown any softness toward the staff. But now, as she watched Lena move through the room with her head held high, a slow smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Mrs. Thompson had seen many things over the years, many displays of wealth, power, and grandeur. But this moment was different. Lena had transcended her role as a maid, had become something more, something impossible to ignore. She met Lena's eyes for a brief moment as the girl passed, and though no words were spoken, there was a silent acknowledgement. It was as if Mrs. Thompson recognized that Lena had taken a step toward something far greater than any position in the Sinclair household. The applause had not been for the spectacle of a maid playing a piano, but for the courage it had taken to break free from the confines of her life, to become someone no one had expected. Outside the ballroom, as the night wore on, Lena retreated to her small room in the servants' quarters. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her bed, still shaking, but with a sense of quiet triumph settling over her. The music, the act of playing it, had been a bridge, a way to connect her past and present, her hopes and her reality. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, and in doing so, she had found a part of herself that had been lost for so long. The quiet, rhythmic ticking of the metronome on her windowsill brought her back to herself, grounding her as she sat in the stillness of her room. She could hear the faint hum of the mansion's sounds, the muffled conversations, the occasional clink of glass, the soft rustling of the guests in the distant ballroom. But they seemed far away now. She was no longer just a figure in the background, caught in the machinery of the estate. She was a person, her own person, with a future that she could now begin to shape on her own terms. For the first time in years, Lena felt a sense of hope stirring within her, not in some distant, unreachable dream, but in the reality of the life she had ahead. The Sinclair estate, its grand halls, its wealth, its cruelty, and its expectations. All of it still existed, but she no longer felt bound by it. She had done something that could never be undone. The music had become her language, and no matter where life took her, it was something no one could take from her. And as she sat in the quiet of her room, Lena finally allowed herself to imagine a future that was hers to claim. A future where the music would never fade, where her dreams would no longer be locked away in the dark corners of her mind. The song of defiance had been heard, and it had made all the difference. A new dawn. Lena awoke the next morning to a sense of stillness that felt different from any other morning. The sun had already risen, casting its early golden light through the small window in her quarters, but today the light seemed to hold more meaning. It wasn't the usual quiet morning in the servants' wing of the Sinclair estate. Today the air felt charged, as though the very fabric of her world had been altered by the music of the night before. She stood at the window for a moment, looking out over the perfectly manicured gardens of the Sinclair estate, the well-tended lawns stretching endlessly before her. But in that moment, she didn't see the perfect, curated world of wealth and grandeur. What she saw instead was the wide expanse of possibilities that lay beyond the estate walls. She saw a future that wasn't dictated by the rigid expectations of her position, a future that was now open to change. She saw a woman who had just reclaimed something that had been hers all along, the right to define who she was and what her life would become. The applause from the night before was still echoing softly in her mind, but it wasn't the applause that mattered anymore. What mattered was the feeling that had surged through her in that quiet moment at the piano, the realization that the music, the very act of playing, had allowed her to break free from the invisible chains that had once bound her. She had reclaimed her voice, and for the first time in years, Lena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in far too long: hope. The routine of the morning began, the same as always. Lena dressed in her uniform, smoothing the fabric with automatic movements, preparing herself for the endless rounds of serving the guests, cleaning the floors, and making sure everything was pristine. But today, there was a difference in the way she moved, a quiet sense of purpose that she had never allowed herself before. She worked efficiently, of course, but her mind was no longer fully absorbed in the tasks that filled her day. It wasn't just the mechanical act of serving the guests anymore. It was the realization that these actions, these small movements, were just that, small movements. She wasn't defined by them. As the day passed, Lena found herself thinking more and more about what had transpired the night before. The applause, though fleeting, had been a powerful moment, but it wasn't the recognition from the guests that lingered. It was the quiet strength she had found in herself, the power to stand in the face of ridicule and turn it into something beautiful. The piano had been her tool, yes, but it had been the music, her heart, that had truly carried her through. The joy of playing again, the sweet release of expressing herself, had awakened something inside her, a spark that refused to die. The evening came, and as Lena moved through the halls of the mansion, her attention was drawn to the grand ballroom, where the piano still sat, silent, waiting. The last time she had been there, it had been a stage for her humiliation, a tool in Mr. Sinclair's hands to entertain the guests at her expense. But now, in the quiet of the evening, the piano seemed less like a trap and more like a beacon. It was not an object of ridicule. It was a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. It had been a moment of defiance, yes, but it had also been a moment of reclamation. As Lena passed the ballroom, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and the soft glow from the chandelier spilled into the hallway, casting long shadows on the floor. The music was no longer something locked away in her heart. It was something real, something she could claim again. She stepped inside the ballroom, the familiar scent of polished wood and candlelight filling her senses. She walked slowly toward the piano, drawn to it as if it were calling her back. Sitting at the bench, she placed her hands on the keys, her fingers lightly grazing the surface. For a moment, she closed her eyes, remembering the music she had once played with her mother. The first few notes came naturally, almost without thought, as though they were part of her. It was as if the piano itself had become a part of her again, the connection between her hands and the keys so strong it felt as though no time had passed at all. For the first time in years, Lena didn't play to please anyone else. She didn't play for recognition, for applause, or for approval. She played for herself, and in doing so, she played with a freedom that was entirely her own. The music, once again, was her own language, a language she had almost forgotten, but now it poured from her fingers like water from a stream. It was an expression of her soul, an affirmation of everything she had come to understand in the days since that fateful gala. The music flowed through her, becoming an extension of herself, a bridge to everything she had felt before. The joy, the sadness, the longing, and the defiance. Each note was a message to herself. She was more than her circumstances, more than the limitations that had been placed upon her. She was a person, a creator, a woman who had the power to shape her own destiny. As the last note of the piece rang out, Lena's heart was light. The room, once filled with judgment and laughter, was now filled with a sense of peace. She was no longer bound by the expectations of others. She was free. It was then that Lena made a decision. She couldn't continue in this place, in this life, forever. The Sinclair estate had been a prison, but she had unlocked the door. She had to leave, to step into the world beyond, where her music could be more than just a hidden treasure. She would find a way to pursue it, whether through teaching, performing, or composing. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time, Lena was ready to seize them. She didn't know exactly how it would happen, or when, but she knew that the first step had already been taken. She had faced her fears, had stood in the spotlight, and had proven to herself that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever given her credit for. She had shown herself that she could create beauty in the most unlikely of circumstances, that the strength of her spirit could never be extinguished by the cruelty of others. That night, as she walked back to her room, Lena knew her life was about to change. The mansion, with all its grandeur and opulence, no longer had the same hold over her. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that her worth was not defined by the world around her, but by the power she held within herself. She had music in her soul, and that was something no one could ever take away. The dawn of a new day was just beginning to break, not just in the world outside, but in her own life. The future stretched before her, filled with promise and hope. And for the first time in a long while, Lena could finally see it. The path to freedom, to fulfillment, to the music that would guide her forward. The melody was her own, and she would play it for the rest of her life. The freedom in the silence. The days that followed Lena's performance at the gala felt like a quiet revolution. The air in the mansion seemed to shift imperceptibly, as though the weight of that night had made the walls breathe in a different way. But despite the soft hum of change, Lena knew that the estate, its gilded halls, and its suffocating expectations would never be the same for her. She had seen through the illusion. She had stepped outside the roles that had been prescribed for her and touched something truer, something her heart had known all along, even when she'd been too afraid to listen. The work continued, of course. The mansion was as grand and demanding as it had ever been. But Lena's perception of her life there had transformed. Where once she had been content to slip through the shadows, now she moved with a quiet purpose, no longer simply existing to fulfill the demands of others. It wasn't arrogance she felt, it was quiet confidence. The rhythm of her hands as they polished silverware or arranged flowers was the rhythm of someone who knew that their worth could not be diminished by the menial tasks they performed. She had found her dignity, not in grand gestures, but in the silent understanding of who she truly was. But though the world around her seemed to stay the same, Lena's heart had shifted. She could no longer ignore the ache for more. The piano, still gleaming in the ballroom, called to her like an unspoken invitation. The music had awakened something inside her, a part of herself that had been dormant for too long, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to reappear. She could no longer play simply for herself, hidden in the shadows of the mansion. She had to share her music with the world, to find the freedom in it that would allow her to live fully. It wasn't long before Lena began to take small steps toward her new life. She started to play more often, but this time, her playing was no longer a rebellion or a secret indulgence. It became a meditation, a quiet reminder of the strength that resided deep within her. The music filled her with a calm certainty that spoke of possibility, and each piece she played brought her closer to the life she could see in her mind. A life where music was no longer a hidden treasure but her true calling. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of work, Lena found herself once again at the grand piano, the notes of a piece she had once known by heart filling the room. She wasn't performing for anyone, but the very act of playing felt like an offering. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. Each chord was like a promise, each note a step toward something unknown, but filled with potential. The piano became more than just an instrument. It was a vessel, a bridge to the world she had yet to fully discover. And in that silence, as she played, Lena understood that the greatest freedom she could claim was not just in her escape from the Sinclair estate, but in her ability to create beauty and share it with others, to let it become her language. Over time, she began to seek small opportunities outside the mansion. She would play at local gatherings, where her presence went unnoticed by the wealthy patrons who paid little attention to the woman behind the music. Still, it was enough. She could feel the change stirring inside her with each performance, however quiet and modest. She shared her music in cafes and small recitals, her fingers working with the same care and precision they had once had as a child, under the watchful eyes of her mother. Every note felt like a declaration, a loud shout in the face of the silence that had once suffocated her. But it wasn't just the music that was changing her, it was the people she met along the way. They didn't know her as the maid from the Sinclair estate. They knew her only as the pianist, the woman who poured her heart into the music she played. The outside world, filled with its small but vivid possibilities, seemed as foreign to her as the mansion had once been. She had once believed that her life was defined by the mansion's walls and the people within them. But now, as she performed for strangers who had no expectations of her, Lena began to understand that it was not the world around her that defined her. It was her ability to carve out a space for herself within it. One evening, as Lena was playing at a small recital in a modest venue, a woman approached her afterward. She was older, with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression, someone who seemed to have spent her life in the company of music. She introduced herself as Alice, a former pianist who now ran a local music school, and she told Lena that she had been captivated by her performance. There was an openness in Alice's words, an invitation that Lena hadn't known she was waiting for. "You have something," Alice said, her voice warm but firm. "Something rare. You must not let it stay hidden, Lena. Music has a way of finding its true path, and I can see it in you. I want to help you share that with the world." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt something stir inside her. It was a feeling of affirmation, the echo of a dream that had once felt unreachable. Alice saw her, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a musician, someone with real potential, with a future in music. That night, after the recital, Lena returned to her small quarters in the servants' wing, her heart beating with something new. She no longer had to hide her music. She didn't have to play only in the shadows of the Sinclair estate or in the confines of her room. She had a choice. She could pursue this dream, this talent, and build a life that was hers, one note at a time. The following weeks were filled with changes, some small, others more profound. Alice guided Lena through her transformation, encouraging her to explore her musical talents with discipline and passion. She introduced Lena to the world of teaching, offering her the opportunity to give lessons at the music school, where she could pass on the knowledge her mother had given her. At first, Lena was hesitant. The thought of teaching terrified her. What did she, a maid from the Sinclair estate, have to offer? But Alice's faith in her was unwavering. "You know music, Lena," she had said. "That's more than enough." And so, slowly but surely, Lena's world expanded. She learned to navigate the world of performance and teaching, her fingers once again dancing over the keys, but now with a newfound purpose. She found herself giving lessons to children, watching their faces light up as they discovered the power of music, just as she had so many years ago. It was through these lessons that Lena began to understand the true value of her gift, not as something to hide away, but as something that could bring joy, solace, and inspiration to others. She was no longer playing for the approval of anyone. She was playing for herself, for the children she taught, and for the world that awaited her. With each lesson, each performance, Lena's confidence grew. She realized that the mansion, the Sinclair estate, had been a chapter of her life, but it was no longer her story. She had left behind the confines of those walls, both physical and emotional, and in doing so, had found something far greater. The music was hers to share, and no one, not even the harshest critic, could take that from her. As the years passed, Lena's name began to circulate in the local music community. She performed at concerts, recitals, and festivals, each time growing stronger and more skilled. She never forgot the lessons her mother had taught her, lessons about playing with heart, about using music as a language of the soul. And through that, Lena found herself not just as a musician, but as a woman who had carved out her own place in the world. The grand piano at the Sinclair estate, once a symbol of her humiliation, no longer held any power over her. She had faced it, had played before an audience that had once sought to break her, and in doing so, had freed herself. And now, as Lena stood before a new audience, sharing her music with the world, she realized that her past had not been a prison. It had been the fire that forged her. The silence, once deafening, had given way to a symphony of freedom. Lena was no longer the maid. She was a pianist, and this was just the beginning. The music of freedom. Years had passed since that fateful evening in the Sinclair mansion, and Lena stood before a packed auditorium, the soft glow of the stage lights casting a warm halo around her. The grand piano before her gleamed under the spotlight, its keys waiting to be touched once more. The sound of the audience settling into their seats was like the quiet hum of anticipation, a sound Lena had come to recognize and embrace. Tonight, she was not a maid, not a servant. She was Lena, the pianist, a woman whose music had spoken louder than any label could. As her fingers touched the keys, she felt the familiar thrill of connection. The instant the music took flight, pulling her into its world. It was no longer a performance for the approval of others. It was her gift to herself and to the world. The melody she played was simple, yet it held all the weight of her journey. The years of silence, the struggle to find her voice, the moment she had chosen to step out from the shadows and claim what was hers. Every note was a small declaration of freedom, each chord a celebration of the path she had walked. The applause that followed was genuine, heartfelt. But even more than the applause, Lena felt something deeper. She felt the connection to those who had come to listen, not to judge, not to expect a spectacle, but to experience the beauty she had so long held within her. She realized that her music had always been a part of her. It had been there when she cleaned the grand halls of the Sinclair estate, when she had hidden her dreams behind the walls of her small room, when she had played quietly in the corners of her mind. But now she shared it freely, knowing it could never be taken from her again. The lesson of her journey had been simple, though not easy to learn, that true freedom comes not from escaping the physical constraints of our circumstances, but from embracing our inner strength and finding the courage to live authentically. For years, Lena had thought she was defined by her role as a maid, that her worth was limited by what others saw in her. But the truth was, she had always been more than that. The key to her freedom wasn't in her escape, but in her recognition of the power within herself. The power to choose, to create, to find meaning in her own life, no matter the challenges she faced. And it was in that freedom that Lena's music truly flourished. She had learned to play not for the approval of others, not as an instrument of entertainment for the wealthy and powerful, but for the joy it gave her. She had found peace in knowing that the beauty she created through music was a reflection of her own truth, not something to be molded by the expectations of those around her. As the concert drew to a close, Lena stood, taking the small bow, her heart full but calm. She had no need for accolades, no desire to be remembered as anything other than the woman who had reclaimed her music, and in doing so her life. The applause continued, but in the midst of it, she felt a quiet contentment. This was enough. She had already won. In the years that followed, Lena's life continued to evolve. She had a small but devoted following, and her reputation as a teacher and performer grew. She opened her own music studio, where she taught children and adults, passing on the lessons she had learned through her own trials. The students who came to her found not just a teacher, but someone who understood the power of perseverance, the importance of self-worth, and the healing nature of music. Lena's story was never one of fame or fortune. It was one of quiet victory, a testament to the fact that no matter where we begin, no matter the limitations placed on us, we each hold the power to change our lives. She had learned that the music was not just a skill, but a language of the soul, a way to express all that words could not. And through that language, she had spoken her truth and had been heard. As Lena sat at the piano one evening, her fingers moving gently over the keys, she thought of the Sinclair estate, of the mansion that had once felt so vast and cold. She thought of the shadows she had once lived in, and of the music that had always been her light. She had walked out of the darkness, not into the world's applause, but into her own self-understanding. The mansion, with all its wealth and grandeur, had never been her world. It had been a place, a chapter in her life, and she had moved on. The music was hers now, not just as a gift to the world, but as a gift to herself. And in that quiet moment, with the soft sound of the piano filling the room, Lena knew that her journey was far from over. There was still much to learn, much to explore, and much to create. But whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and grace that had carried her this far. For the first time in her life, Lena was truly free. Free to live her truth, free to make her music, and free to embrace the beauty of the life she had built. And that, she knew, was the most beautiful music of all. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.